In August 1863, a 29-year-old inventor named Christopher Spencer walked onto the grounds near the White House and handed his rifle to Abraham Lincoln. He'd come because the United States Army had already told him no. The Army's own Chief of Ordnance, Brigadier General James Wolfe Ripley, had looked at a rifle that fired 7 rounds without reloading and seen a problem instead of an advantage. Too much ammunition, too much waste. Soldiers, he was certain, would burn through cartridges the wagons could never replace. Spencer went over his head, straight to the president. Lincoln raised the rifle himself, sighted on a target board, and started firing. He liked what he felt. Within weeks, Ripley was pushed into retirement, and Spencer repeaters were on their way to Union cavalry, the same repeaters that helped break Confederate charges in the last 2 years of the war. Sit with what that took. It took the president himself pulling a trigger to get American soldiers a better rifle than the men who bought rifles wanted them to have. That's not a one-time oddity. That's the pattern, and it runs under almost every rifle this country ever carried into battle, right up to a rifle the Army started quietly walking away from this year. The pattern's older than the Army itself. When the Continental Army marched in 1776, most men carried a musket that wasn't even ours, the British Brown Bess in .75 caliber, or the French Charleville in .69, shipped over once France joined the fight. Borrowed guns. Smoothbores you couldn't trust to hit a man across a wide road. And the weapon that actually made Americans dangerous, the long rifle. The Pennsylvania and Kentucky rifles that dropped British officers at 200 yards was never standard issue. It stayed with frontier specialists because the smoothbore was cheaper and easier to feed. The shape was set at the founding. The gun that made our soldier deadly wasn't the gun his own side handed him. A century later, the same instinct still ran things. In 1873, the Army adopted the Springfield trapdoor in .45-70. A single shot, 1 round at a time, in a decade when repeaters already existed, and Spencer had already proven them. 3 years later, the 7th Cavalry carried those single shots into the Little Bighorn. You've heard the rifles jammed. That copper cases swelled, and men died prying them out. Hold that one. The record's more complicated than the legend, and it cuts the other way. By 1898, above Santiago, the humiliation was plain. Our troops climbing toward San Juan carried the Krag Jorgensen, a 30-40 you fed 1 round at a time through a side gate. The Spanish above them had 7mm Mausers loaded from stripper clips, 5 at once, flatter, reaching farther. Americans outranged by a smaller army with a better rifle. That forced the 1903 Springfield, which copied Mauser so closely our government paid royalties to a German arms maker until we entered the First World War, and the checks stopped. And the rifle most doughboys actually carried in France? By most accounts, 3 of every 4 held not the famous 1903, but the M1917, the American Enfield, forgotten because it wore the wrong name. Before this turns into a story where the bureaucrats are always fools and the field is always right, I owe you the other side because the men who bought these rifles were sometimes right. Ripley in 1863 wasn't just a frightened old man. A repeater really did burn ammunition 3 or 4 times faster, and in a black powder war supplied by mules, running your men dry mid-fight was a real way to lose. He was wrong about the Spencer. The fear behind it wasn't foolish. That Little Bighorn story I told you to hold. The battlefield archaeology, the actual cartridge cases dug up and studied a century later, says jammed extractors were a minor factor, not why Custer lost. He lost because he split a small command and rode into a village far larger than he grasped. The trapdoor took the blame for a general's mistake. And the clearest case of the office men getting it right came in 1932. The Army was set to build John Garand's new semi-automatic in a lighter round, the .276 Pedersen, and Douglas MacArthur overruled it, keeping it in 3006 because the country had warehouses of it, and every machine gun already ran it. MacArthur was right, and that stubborn call is a big part of why the Garand worked when the shooting came. The lesson isn't that the brass is always wrong. Hold on to that. It's what makes the next chapter so much harder to forgive. The Garand carried us through the Second World War and Korea. Its replacement, the M14 and 7.62 NATO, barely lasted a decade. And here's the irony nobody says out loud. America strong-armed our allies into adopting that big 7.62 round, then dumped it for the little 5.56 almost before the paint dried, which drops us into Vietnam and onto Eugene Stoner. Stoner had built something nobody had fielded before, the AR-15, adopted as the M16. Light, a small, fast 5.56 millimeter round. A rifle a man could carry all day with more ammunition than he'd ever hauled, and he designed it around one specific propellant, an extruded stick powder, clean and predictable, the powder the rifle was tuned to run on. Then the ordnance establishment changed it. They swapped Stoner's stick powder for a ball powder, cheaper, and already sitting in the pipeline by the ton. But ball powder burned dirtier and ran at higher pressure, fouling the action and working the rifle harder than it was built to take. Then they shipped it to the jungle and told the troops it was self-cleaning. Almost no cleaning kits, almost no training. A rifle sold as maintenance-free, handed to men in the wettest, filthiest fighting on earth. The rifles jammed in firefights. A spent case would tear loose and lock up in a hot, foul chamber, and a man's only fix was to ram a cleaning rod down the muzzle and punch it out, if he had a rod, if he had the seconds. Soldiers and Marines were found dead in the grass beside rifles they'd taken apart trying to clear. By 1967, Congress had to step in. A House subcommittee under Representative Richard Eichord of Missouri dug into all of it, and the report didn't flinch. The failure of Army officials to fix a defect they already knew about, it said, bordered on criminal negligence. Not the rifle's fault, not Stoner's, the bureaucracy's. 50 years you've heard the M16 was junk, a plastic toy that got good men killed. Here's the documentation. The rifle wasn't the junk. The decision was. Subscribe if you're still with me. What's ahead isn't history. It's the rifle the Army's quietly walking back right now, in 2025 and 2026, for reasons Eugene Stoner would have recognized in a heartbeat. That's the part that changes how you read the news. Here's where this stops being history and becomes the rifle in your safe. Out of every service arm in that whole 250-year line, exactly one is a gun you can still buy straight from the United States government, the M1 Garand, through the Civilian Marksmanship Program. And that door is closing faster than most people watching this realize. 3 years ago, a field-grade Garand from the CMP ran about $650, a real World War II rifle, arsenal refinished, shipped to your door. Then the shelves went bare. Service grade sold out in October of 2024. Rack grade in January 2025. The M1C Sniper in July. Field grade and the Winchester and International Harvester rifles, gone by December 2025. What's left today is basically the expert grade at around $1,150 and a custom shop rifle at $1,650. On the private market, the average Garand now runs about $1,450, and a Winchester or a matching International Harvester routinely breaks $2,500. Which brings me to the thing worth pausing this video for. If you've got a Garand inherited from your father, bought years back, sitting in the back of the safe, go look at the left side of the receiver. The serial number stamped there dates the rifle to the year it was built. And right there with it, the maker's initials. SA is Springfield Armory. HRA is Harrington and Richardson. IHC is International Harvester. And WRA, that's Winchester Repeating Arms. The Springfields are the common ones. But a Winchester, or a Matching Parts International Harvester, is the rifle plenty of owners are holding without ever knowing they're standing on the premium. Most sellers don't look. Most buyers don't know to. And if you can't turn up an old one and you still want a Garand in the family, the CMP started selling brand new production rifles in 2025, built by Heritage Arms, around $1,900, the first new commercial Garands made since 1957, serial numbers starting at 1001. Line it all up, and the same truth runs end to end. The rifles that became legends, the Spencer, the Garand, even the M16 once that powder scandal was fixed, and it grew into the M16A1 that served for decades. Those were the guns that had to beat the bureaucracy, not the ones the bureaucracy drew up clean. The rifle that had to fight its way into a soldier's hands is almost always the rifle that earned the soldier's trust. That's the real reason the surplus gun in your safe holds its value the way it does. It isn't nostalgia, and it isn't just age. That Garand is a survivor of a fight, the same fight Christopher Spencer walked onto the White House lawn to win in 1863. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and he wasn't reading a spec sheet. He meant a rifle that worked when men's lives rode on it working. And here's the honest part I promised to keep in front of you. The lesson isn't that the government's always the villain. Sometimes the field man is dead, wrong, and sometimes the careful man at the desk is the one who saved the day. MacArthur and that 30-06 call, to name one. The pattern isn't brass bad, it's simpler and harder than that. The men closest to the fight, the shooter, and the man who designed his rifle usually saw the truth first and usually had to wait for everyone above them to catch up, which carries us right up to today, and a rifle that hasn't earned its legend yet and might not get the chance. The M7, SIG's 6.8mm, built to replace the M4 and the whole M16 family that's armed this country since the 60s. The Army began fielding it in March 2024 with the 101st Airborne and type classified it as the M7 in May 2025. On paper, it hits harder. A heavier round meant to punch through modern body armor the 5.56 can't touch. Then the reports came back. An Army captain who inspected the rifles and interviewed the men carrying them called the M7 unfit for use as a modern service rifle. Cartridge cases coming apart under pressure, barrels wearing fast, key parts breaking, and the arithmetic that makes anybody who's ever carried a rifle wince. The M7 soldier hauls about 140 rounds where the M4 man carried 210, 70 fewer rounds, a heavier rifle, and less to feed it. Here's the tell. As of the fall of 2025, the Army has stopped buying new M7 rifles altogether, not one new order since October, and shifted the money to a shorter carbine, the XM8, while calling whatever comes next pre-decisional. The Marine Corps looked at the whole program and walked away, holding on to the rifle they already trust. Spencer would know the shape of this. So would Stoner. The men in the field are raising their hands, and the only question left is the same one it's always been. Who gets believed? Walk into a gun shop this month and you'll hear it live. One man at the counter is defending the M7 off a printout of ballistics numbers. The other, gray, a little heavy, a Vietnam patch on his cap, just shakes his head and says he's heard the Army promise a new rifle would fix everything before. And on the rack behind them, a used M1 Garand leans in the corner, its maker's mark unread, priced like it's just one more old gun. The argument that started on Lincoln's lawn in 1863 is still going. Only the rifle on the counter has changed, and the one behind them is worth more than either man has noticed. Go look at the left side of the receiver on the Garand in your safe, SAHRAIHC or WRA, and tell me what your father or your grandfather carried and whether you'd trust that M7 the way you trusted the rifle he handed down. Subscribe if you want the fights the magazines never printed.